Hi, my name is John. Welcome back to Reddit Aliens. True crime lovers of Reddit, what is a case that still haunts you to this day? Not safe for work? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Guy in Ireland, Ellen Hall, who murdered his family and committed suicide, he reorganized the living room furniture so his wife wouldn't see him approach with the axe. The first strike didn't kill her. She had defensive wounds. He then went the beds of his 3 sons, and from oldest to youngest, he knelt on them and cut their throats. They would have felt the pressure and woke in time to see their dad kill them. He then hung himself, leaving a note on the door saying, "Call the police and don't come in." Completely senseless, just an awful human being. Shanda Scherer. A group of teen girls tortured her, sodomized her, burned her alive. Absolutely sickening. It's gotta be Albert Fish. They finally caught the bastard as an old man, but that wretch essentially got away with raping, murdering, torturing, and eating countless children. He also wrote letters to his victims' parents detailing what he did to their children. I'm hard-pressed to find a worse example of our species. Forensic psych counselor here. This one is a real client I had. So for background, my client had a mental disability and a background in robbing people. The following is the case he got convicted for and eventually put under my care. Guy breaks into some other guy's home at the dead of night, sneaks his way through the house, which is fitted with all kinds of disability adjustments, so he makes his way to the bedroom and wakes up the victim. He has a few tools with him, threatens the victim to stay in bed or else, so he complies. He tells the victim that he wants to know where he keeps his money. Victim refuses, says he has barely anything, so the perp calmly explains he's going to torture him if he doesn't comply. Victim refuses still, says he has nothing. Guy takes out a pair of bolt cutters, proceeds to individually remove every single toe the victim has. The victim refuses to comply. He doesn't even try to get out of bed. In fact, he barely makes a noise in response to the cutting, though he does keep shouting for police. 10 toes later, the perp gives up and hightails it out of there. Later on, perp gets arrested and charged. It is only then that he finds out the victim was paralyzed from the waist down and didn't feel an effing thing. There really are loads, to be honest, but the one I thought about last was Chris Watts' family. You have Dahmer, Gain, Bundy, Holmes, etc., but the Watts one makes me sad. The Frankford slasher, Philly, late 80s to early 90s. A guy did some truly despicable and horrifying things to women who lived at risk, those with drug issues, sex workers, etc. I won't describe how he killed them, but what he did was horrible. They had a description of the guy, white guy, glasses, possibly posing as a religious leader or counselor, aka someone a person looking to turn their life around might trust. After 8 victims, the cops arrested a black guy, who 2 people claimed and later recanted they saw talk to the 8th victim. While he was in jail, another woman was killed. He was still convicted. That poor man died in prison a few years ago. His name was Leonard Christopher. None of the other Frankfurt slasher murderers were ever solved, outside of the 8th victim, whose death was attributed to Mr. Christopher. Those 9 women never got justice. I wish someone would cover this case, get it some attention so that Mr. Christopher's name could be cleared, and the women brought some peace. I relatively recently learned of the 8 Immortals murders. The 8 Immortals was the name of a restaurant in Macau in the 1980s. The owner ran up a gambling debt to an acquaintance and then refused to pay. After about a year of trying to collect the debt, the guy who was owed was in the restaurant one evening after hours and got into a fight with the owner over the debt. He ended up taking one of the owner's sons hostage, holding a broken beer bottle to his neck, and forced the rest of the family to be tied each other up. At the end of the process, the owner's wife tried to make a break for it, and he stabbed her in the neck. Then, with one already dead, to cover his tracks, he systematically killed the bound captives. The owner, the owner's cousin, and the wife's mother were all also stabbed through the neck. He then strangled the family's 4 children. He then also lured the wife's sister to the restaurant and killed her as well, after one of the children told him, "My aunt will have you arrested." He spent the rest of the night dismembering all the bodies of his 9 victims and throwing the pieces into the ocean. Then he just started running the restaurant as if he was the new owner. When extended family members reported the victims missing and a bunch of unidentified body parts from multiple people started washing up on the shore, the police put two and two together and went to talk to the guy running the family restaurant with a conspicuously absent family. He was unable to produce any documentation showing he was the legal owner and was quickly arrested and confessed.
Oh, this was one I had never heard of before, so thank you for sharing. I mean, it's a terrible outcome, but still interesting.
The Toy Box Killers heard the recording they used to play for teaching their slaves. Gosh, that was horrifying. Toolbox Killers, Junko Ferrata, Hello Kitty, and also that one case I forgot the name, but it was South Africa, and this girl was raped and the rapist tried to sever her head. Girl wasn't dead, even though her head was nearly decapitated, and she dragged herself, holding her own head straight, and she was saved. This case was really fascinating. There's so many that stick with me, in no particular order. Shelley Nodek. I read If You Tell by Greg Olson and legitimately thought it was fiction until I heard her crimes covered on And That's Why We Drink. Matthew Shepard, tortured and beaten to death for being openly gay. Sylvia Likens, abused and murdered by her caregiver and other people as well. Ariel Castro, abduction and imprisonment of Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus. Sticks out to me because these women escaped after years of suffering through Castro's abuse. Israel Keyes is one that I come back to a lot. This guy was meticulous, and his case really shows just how impossible it can be for police to catch a serial killer who plans things out well and strikes at random. He would travel all around the US and would bury murder kits in places that would not be easily discovered, hidden in trees, buried deep underground, etc. Then he would fly back home and leave that kit there for months or even years. Then, when he got the urge, he would come back for it. But if his murder kit was in New York, for instance, he wouldn't fly directly to New York. He would fly to Philadelphia, rent a car, and then drive to New York. Then he would dig up his kit, commit his murders, drive back to Philly, and fly home. There would never ever be a record of him being in New York because he wouldn't purchase anything. He would have gotten away with it basically forever, if not for the fact that he got greedy one time and used the victim's ATM card. When he was caught, he gave the police some information to close a few cold cases, implied that he could potentially hundreds of murders all over the country, and then committed suicide, taking the information with him to the grave. His case really made me realize that the serial killers we know about are the ones that are reckless or dumb enough to make a major mistake. The ones that are better at it, we have virtually no hope of ever catching them. I watched a crime documentary about this woman who lived with her boyfriend and young daughter, around 2 to 3 years old. The girl's bio father was very much in the picture and wanted her to live with him. The mom's boyfriend came up with this crazy list of rules that the little girl had to follow. That would be unreasonable for any kid, much less a literal toddler. So of course she broke the rules by being a normal, rambunctious, small child. And the boyfriend decided he would take the whole day and just train her, or whatever, basically beat her into submission, so she wouldn't act out again. He beat her with a belt and just kept beating her. The mom, for some god-awful reason, never stopped him and even assisted him. The little girl died from her injuries, which was not their intention apparently. They just got carried away, and the effing sickos put her body in a cooler and dumped it in a lake, which of course was found by people who were out boating, and the poor thing was a Jane Doe for a while. Then the mom came in and confessed. During the confession, she was describing all the awful things they had done to her, and said that while they were beating her, this poor, sweet baby kept saying, "I love you," god damn it, to the mom and boyfriend, as if that would maybe make them stop, die. That honestly just ruined me, and I've never been able to get over it. I still randomly think about it, and the poor bio dad was obviously heartbroken, and now has to live with the fact that this happened to his little girl, and he was powerless to stop it. The kidnapping and murder of Amber Hagerman. Was friends with her parents back on 95. I lived pretty close to where this happened. I wish we could have found her alive and well, but that was not to be. Arlington really came together to search for her. This case still bothers me to this day, that no one has been arrested or charged in her death. No one deserves what her and her family went through. The only silver lining to this case, the Amber Alert. Brazil. Suzanne von Richthofen. No, because it was particularly brutal or anything. She was a 19-year-old millionaire kid that was literally in law school. She convinced her boyfriend, Daniel Kravinos, and his brother, Christian, to murder her parents, beat up to death with steel bars because they were in the way. They just didn't like her boyfriend and thought she should live a little since she was obsessed with Daniel. Her brother, Andreas, that was 14 at the time, and herself deny any accusations that their parents were ever abusive or toxic. They just didn't like her boyfriend and got in the way, so she decided to kill them and even got other people to do the dirty work for her. She threw a party at the house where the murders happened a couple of days after. She had no intention of moving out. She would just change the mattress since it got stained with blood. I don't know, this case haunts me. How can anyone be so cold?
Picking up some shades of the Menendez brothers with this story here. I hadn't heard of this one either, so interesting to hear. Terrible that it was.
I will never in my life ever accept or understand why humankind horrendously failed baby Brianna Lopez. I just can't ever get over that case, what they did to her little baby body. I've never hated someone so much in my life as I do her family, and I type this with tears. Gabriel Fernandez has to be the second in my book, though he did have family members that loved him and wanted him to be saved, as he too should have. Baby Brianna, that baby literally had nobody that wanted to love her, and what they did to her keeps me awake some night in tears. Awful, awful people. Israel Keyes, truly a terrible man. A well-regarded father and husband went on work trips only to hide kill kits around the US. Within years of hiding the kits, he would return to the town, unearthing it and using its contents to commit murder and sexual violence on strangers. Never left any evidence. The only reason he was caught is because he got overconfident and allowed himself to be filmed kidnapping a young woman. Most criminals are dumb, but he was so organized and consistent, it scares me to think of more people that kill like he did. There are obviously the famous stories, but there is one that has stuck with me for the last couple of years that has not been covered much in the English-speaking world. The case of Alexandra Masinow. She was a 15-year-old Romanian girl who was abducted by a man and managed to contact authorities while in confinement. I believe that she was able to find the cell phone of a previous victim of her captor in order to do so, but I don't remember. The response from the dispatcher was unbelievably cold and uncaring. I believed that she may have been saved if not for the incompetence of the dispatcher and possibly the police force as a whole. I think that she may have even been on the phone with an officer who was equally callous and unhelpful, but it's been a while since I've looked into the story, so I may be wrong on that point. The case sparked public outrage in Romania and was a big deal at the time, but I don't know if there was ever any justice for Alexandra Masinow. Jessica Chambers. She was set on fire in her car and had gasoline poured down her throat. She was found by paramedics walking down the road before she collapsed. The only part of her body that was not burned was the bottom of her feet. She did not survive. They have a suspect, but he was never charged. Robert Pickton. One of my friends from childhood was raised by her grandmother. Her mom had gotten into a bad situation and left, so her grandmother took over. As kids, we never really asked about that kind of stuff. But when we got older and the news broke of his arrest, it took a dark turn. Turns out, her mom was one of his victims. They found her DNA in the relevant areas of the farm, but unfortunately, her case was one of the 20 that was stayed. It haunted me learning what we had done to those women. As a teenager, I couldn't imagine what it would have felt like to know that had happened to my own mom. As an adult, it breaks my heart knowing the number of years my friend spent thinking her mom just didn't care. All in all, it just hit home in a different way. This was a huge uproar in Korea. The graphic details are unmentioned in the wiki for good reason. Look up the Cho Do-soon case or non-wiki sources. The atrocity was compounded by the incompetence and callousness of the prosecution, as well as the absurdity of the light sentence due to the legal loopholes around crimes committed while intoxicated. But that's just scratching the surface of what makes this an absolute shit show, where victims to this day are continued to made to suffer without justice. The case of Issei Sagawa. He met a young Dutch woman who was his classmate while he was in France studying literature. He gained her trust over time, and one day he invited her to his apartment and told her he would help her catch up on some assignments she missed. While she was at his desk focusing on the assignment, he left the room and slowly crept up behind her and shot her point blank in the back of the head with a rifle. He ate portions of her body, refrigerated more parts, then stuffed the rest of the body inside 2 travel bags that he abandoned at a local park. He was caught 4 days later and ordered to be held in a French mental institution, thanks in part to his wealthy father having hired a good defense attorney. However, French citizens didn't want their tax dollars to be used to pay for his stay there, so following national outcry, Issei was deported back to Japan. Due to the fact that he was found to be criminally insane to stand trial, his murder charges were dropped and his case files were sealed by French authorities. This meant that Japanese authorities had nothing to charge Issei with, so they had no choice but to let him walk away a free man upon his arrival to Japan. He wrote a book about the whole ordeal, too. Neha Ann Phillip and Brian Schaefer both went missing in fairly perplexing ways and haven't been seen since. Neha was last seen September 10, 2001, or maybe a couple minutes before the first plane hit the Twin Towers, and officially is listed as a victim of the attacks, but there's no solid proof. Brian walked into a bar and was never seen leaving the bar or seen again. Basically, every theory as to what happened with them honestly makes tons of sense. I have my ideas, but honestly, they're just guesses. Asher Degree. A little girl went missing one night. Unlike Neha and Brian, none of the explanations as to what happened to her make sense. The Korean case of the gummy toddler, Boram, where the family lived in the apartment underneath their daughter's apartment and the poor toddler was found practically mummified from starving to death. There were so many twists, especially with the DNA test results, but what got to me was the fact that they were living underneath the apartment where the toddler was taking her last breath. How could they have not known she was starving to death? Wouldn't they have heard her cries? Absolutely vile. Still brings me to tears if I think about it for too long. All that's how and whys are haunting. Israel Keyes. Most major podcasts have covered this case. The only reason he was caught was because he got sloppy. He gave information that only the killer would know to multiple disappearances and gave locations to their bodies and multiple kill kits around the US. No one knows how many people he has truly killed. He was a totally normal dude. He just had this evil side that he hid perfectly. It's eye-opening because the good killers are never caught. The only serial killers that have been caught were the bad ones.
So we heard from a few subscribers today about Israel Keyes. Did you know to the extent that his crimes were planned out and the way they were committed? Have you never heard of him before? Interesting, terrible, but
The West Memphis 3, a witch hunt to wrongly prosecute 3 teenage boys for the murder of 3 young boys, prosecuted based on the coerced confession of one of the teenagers. They spent 20 years in prison only to be released after signing an Alford plea, admitting that there is enough evidence to find them guilty. They're still fighting to clear their names. Recently wanted to retest some evidence, and the evidence was apparently burned up in a fire. The fire department came out and said that was impossible. The police chief then resigned, and the evidence mysteriously reappeared. They have now been blocked on testing the evidence. Appeal coming up in June. Not only were 3 sweet kids brutally murdered, but they went on to ruin 3 more boys' lives and still aren't putting in effort to find the murderers. The disappearance of Maura Murray. There are so many odd clues, so many witnesses the day she disappeared. You would think the case could be solved. It's been almost 2 decades and the family is still working to find what happened to her. The amount of details and seemingly contradictory clues can send you down a deep rabbit hole. There are several completely different theories, and honestly, any of them could be real if you look at certain clues in certain ways. There are a lot of info on the case online, and more details have been released over the years. This case should be solvable, and I sincerely hope this family can get some closure soon. Because of how close to home it is, the murder of Michaela Hart McCarthy. She was an Irish language and religious teacher from Northern Ireland and the daughter of the long-serving manager of County Tyrone's GAA, Gaelic football team, who was strangled to death in her and her new husband's hotel room while on honeymoon in Mauritius. A few hotel employees were charged but found not guilty, and one of them committed suicide some years later. Those in charge of the case couldn't have handled it any worse, and there's still an ongoing boycott against the island by Irish folk. There's a podcast on Spotify about it, narrated by her widowed husband, called Murder in Mauritius. It's heart-wrenching to listen to. The circumstances surrounding the case are obviously still ongoing and get more bizarre with every new detail that emerges. And if I recall, the government of Mauritius reopened the case a while ago. It's one that barely gets any coverage in the true crime sphere, but one that all of Ireland felt and still mourns, especially due to lack of justice. Catherine Knight killed her partner, skinned him, hung the skin, pelt, near the front door, among other atrocities involving cannibalism. I keep thinking how horrifying it must have been to be the first person to walk into the scene. I read when the cops finally got inside, one of them brushed against the skin in the dark, not knowing what it was. That's just a lot to take in.